Also, this will be recorded. So welcome, everybody. Let me show. So thank you, everybody, for attending. We haven't had a webinar in probably in 2 months. So I appreciate the number of people who have attended this webinar. This month, we'll be presenting on best practices for creating web content. And our presenter is Dearie. Some of you all, she may sound familiar as she was the webinar moderator for Drupal for Gov in the past, before I started. Jess is a federal employee who works for EPA, and she's also a Drupal for Gov organizer. So before I hand it over to Jess, I kind of want to talk about Drupal for Gov and what we do. So we are a community of open source advocates interested in making government more open source. So some of the things that we offer are Drupal GovCon. We didn't have one this year. We're working toward having one next year, and we'll provide more information when we have it. We also do the global training days and half training days. And when we start that again, we'll also communicate that via our email blasts. The Gov Summit at DrupalCon North America, and this monthly webinar, which we do every third Thursday. If you're interested in presenting or want more information about Drupal for Gov, please reach out to us. We're available on Slack. Our email is drupalforgov@gmail.com, as well as on Twitter. And if you miss a webinar, we always upload our webinars to YouTube. So please visit us at Drupal for Gov NP. And you can also, after this webinar, I will be uploading this webinar, a link to the YouTube video. So you can go there, as well as seeing past webinars that we've done. Also, I want to share what we plan on presenting. So for November, we will have a webinar on creating accessible web content by Michaela from ATEN. And in December, our presentation topic will be, "It is time we prioritize web sustainability, building low carbon websites" by Mike Gifford. And last but definitely not least, Jess Dearie is a federal employee, as I mentioned before. She manages at EPA. She manages 2 large internal Drupal websites, and she wears many hats, from UI UX, content strategy, site building, and she also trains. She's an active member of Drupal for Gov and is involved, and I'm happy to say I've worked with her on planning Drupal GovCon. And she's also co-led the DrupalCon Government Summits for the last 7 years. So Jess, take it away.
Thank you, Nika. All things government and Drupal, right?
Yes.
Let me just take a second here to share my screen. And then we'll dive right in. Are you all able to see my slides? I'm not getting the little green bar that tells me they're being shared. Let me try again. Screen 2, share.
And also, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat and we can moderate them that way.
Yes, thank you. So are my screens displaying for everybody?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Welcome. Let's go ahead and dive right in. As Nika mentioned, my name is Jessica Dearie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Caucasian woman with shoulder length blonde hair, but to save my internet today, I have chosen to remain off video. So I appreciate you bearing with me on that. I can be reached on Drupal.org as Dearie or Jess Dearie on Twitter. I'm a wife, I'm a mom, 4 amazing kids, 2 doggies, although my kids are significantly older than that picture. I need to update it. Earlier this year, I retired from the DC Air National Guard, where I spent nearly 27 years in service. I'm a federal employee at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm also very active in Drupal for Gov. So this quote, I've heard other people say, I'm a government employee, I do all the things, right? Well, most of our web content creators do not have a background in web. They are hardworking people who are experts in their field, but they don't necessarily know much about writing for the web. So how do you ensure good content on your pages when your authors have little knowledge on writing for the web, usability, or accessibility? Well, at the EPA, we've developed a multi-pronged approach of training, some key support personnel, and a formal review process. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you one of the training sessions on best practices for web content. I've actually submitted a session on our review process to DrupalCon, so perhaps I'll have the opportunity to share that process there. Writing for the web. So before you write anything, it's always important to answer 3 questions. 1, who is this for? How much do they know about the topic, right? You want to identify the gaps in their knowledge that you can fill in. And knowing who this is for also lets you know when it's okay to use and maybe not always have to explain certain technical terms. 2, what do they want? Are they looking for a fact? Understanding the subject? Perhaps they need to make a decision. Make sure you structure and format your content to help them meet that goal. And 3rd, what do you want? Why are you writing this content? What impact do you want it to have on the reader? And what do you want them to do? By answering those 3 questions, you're much more likely to develop a page that actually helps users meet their goals, as well as meet the goals that you yourself have placed for that content. But as you answer these questions and you write your pages, it's important that you write in plain language. Now, for those of us that work in the federal government, the Plain Writing Act was signed in October of 2010, and that law requires federal agencies to use clear government communication that the public can understand and use. And science tells us that people are more likely to retain and trust the information that they can understand with little effort. So by using words that are easy to process, you'll be able to communicate information and ideas clearly and effectively. Because your content won't be considered clear unless your users can find what they need, understand what they find, and use what they find to meet their needs. But then we also hear, oh, I write for a highly technical audience, or for me at the EPA, we often have a very large scientific audience or high academia. But studies show that highly educated online readers crave succinct information that is easy to scan, just like everyone else. So it's important, again, that you know your audience, you choose your words that are familiar to your audience, write with short sentences and paragraphs. And while many people say that you can write for a 10th to 12th grade reading level, when you're writing for the general public, it's often even recommended for an even lower grade level than that. You also want to make sure that you're following web formatting rules for readability, and we're going to spend some more time talking about what those are. But just remember, being direct and plain spoken, it's not talking down, it's clear communication. So how do people actually read your content? Well, to be honest, they don't. People rarely read online. They're far more likely to scan than read word for word. So if no one is going to read your content, how do you present the information to get it to the reader? This is where chunking comes into play. And chunking is the breaking up of content into small units of information. For example, if I asked you to remember a long string of numbers, 191955552743, do you think you could? You might find it easier to remember this phone number if it were chunked. So now, instead of 11 numbers, you only need to memorize 4 chunks. So 1-919-555-2743. It's important that we break up our web content in the same way. Human short-term memory is limited. So if you want your users to retain information, pack that information into meaningful chunks. But simply chunking your text isn't enough. You also need to support scanning by making it easy to quickly identify the main points of the chunks. And you can do that by including things like headlines. Those are our headlines and subheadlines, or headers and subheaders, depending on the terminology you're used to. Using things like bulleted lists or tables to help simplify more complex content. Highlighting specific keywords and phrases. Writing in the inverted pyramid style, where we start with the conclusion. Or for longer articles, you might want to consider featuring an explicit summary or overview. So headlines and subheadlines, this is the formatting or structuring of headers and within your page. Headers need to tell readers something useful. So this particular headline, for example, is too broad. Make better, faster decisions with data visualization. Where if you compare that to data visualization helps you detect and prevent fraud faster, you can see where that second headline is far more specific and provides more detailed information to the user. It's also important that you front load your headings with strong keywords. Let's compare these two headlines. 1, behold the new technologies for creating 3D imagery. Or 2, creating 3D imagery gets easier with new technologies. Our first example runs the risk of not being read because that key phrase, creating 3D imagery, is positioned at the end, and users would need to read the entire headline to understand its meaning. The second version is better. Moving the keywords to the front makes the heading more scannable, and people can read only the first few words and still understand what the article is about. Bulleted lists can also save users time and help them scan content more quickly, but only when they are used correctly. For example, let's look at some text here on the screen. I'll read it out loud. Version 1. Our spa getaway package includes 2-night accommodation, 2 50-minute spa treatments of your choice, an in-room breakfast for 2, and a gift basket upon arrival. And that version 1 is written as a full sentence, where if we compare it with version 2, our spa getaway package includes, and then it includes a 4-item bulleted list for each of those specific items. So we don't need to worry that our second version takes up more vertical screen space. It's easier to scan and quickly capture the information as a reader to understand what that spa getaway package includes when those items are placed in a bulleted list. And again, the fact that it takes up more vertical screen space shouldn't matter, because studies show that users don't mind scrolling if, and we say only if, they feel that they get interesting information as their eye moves down the screen. So a website that feels inviting and is easier to understand because of an appropriate use of bulleted lists is far more likely to have users scroll than a website that repels its users with walls of text. There are some additional tips to keep in mind when you're using bulleted lists or lists in general. You want to make sure that those list items are similar in length. And numbered lists are usually reserved for instances in which the items need to occur in a specific order, such as steps in a procedure, or when keeping count is important, such as a top 10 item list. You want to avoid repeating the same word at the beginning of each list item. And you should always introduce a list with a descriptive sentence or phrase to help provide context about what the list will contain. And if you have list items that are sentences, it's recommended to capitalize the first word of every list item and use ending punctuation. And if the list items are fragments, that you not use end punctuation. And while there's not a specific rule that says you should capitalize the first word of every list, it's recommended that capitalizing the first word makes it easier to scan. Your agency may have other specific writing standards, and you should certainly keep them in mind. But in the absence of them, the recommendation is if it's in sentences, capitalization with punctuation, fragments, capitalization at the beginning without end punctuation. And vertical lists are best when you have at least 3 items, 3 or more items that you want to attract attention to. Shorter than 3 is generally overkill and usually works better embedded in a sentence. And wherever possible, avoid embedding a list within a list because they can be really difficult to follow. You should always start your content with the most important piece of information so that readers can get the main point, regardless of how much they read. We call this writing in the inverted pyramid style, where you start with the conclusion and all of the information users need to know, and then the farther down the page, it's all of the nice to know information. And if you have particularly longer articles, you can actually provide an explicit summary at the top to summarize that article, and a user will then scroll if they're motivated to read more information. Let's talk about frequently asked questions. This is one of my favorite quotes given by Catherine Catania, who at the time was the chief of the Plain Language and Content Division at the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, that FAQs can be overwhelming and leave your customers searching through a sea of content. The chance of you writing the question in the way that your user thinks to ask is nearly impossible. FAQs can be very difficult to scan, and most users tend to give up on using them if they're trying to find information about a particular subject. Users look for keyword phrases in headlines and menu titles, not FAQs. So FAQs on a subject does not often give a user confidence that they're going to find the information that they're looking for. So if you happen to have a bunch of FAQs and those FAQs are the only way in which that information is being presented to your users, you should think about converting them. So there are some relatively straightforward steps that are not all that time consuming, depending on the volume of content that you have in those FAQs, but some steps that you can take to convert those FAQs into regular web paragraph and headline-based content. The first thing you should do is read through all of your FAQs first, then go through and group them by topic or subject. Develop some headings for each of those sections, and then try to organize the content in a way that makes sense to the reader. Read through each section and then edit the content. Focus on steps in a process and think about what the reader is trying to accomplish. And of course, eliminate redundancies. We had a lot of this FAQ content on our intranet, and we've been going through the process of converting them so that what we found is that in many cases, a question can simply be converted to a headline, and the answer, a word change here or there, and you now have a headline and paragraph content. Or perhaps a combination of 2 or 3 questions make up then some paragraph content about a particular subject. But there are times when FAQs are appropriate. So when that's the case, it's important to structure them the right way. So again, you want to make sure that you are supplementing your main content with FAQs, not replacing the main content. Don't use FAQs to explain an entire process. You should have internal pages that explain those more basics. Try to use, as much as possible, real customer feedback. Don't try to assume the types of questions people will have, and don't write questions that you want users to ask. Monitor customer calls and emails to try to help create helpful FAQs. FAQs have a simplistic information design that does not scale well. So they really should be reserved for frequently asked questions, since that's the only thing that really makes an FAQ a useful website feature. And again, make sure that you are providing unique content with your FAQs. When an FAQ has the same content as other web pages, it usually means that the FAQ content is redundant and it can easily become outdated, especially when content to the website is updated, but the FAQs are not. And as I've mentioned previously, limit the volume of content. When there are too many questions, searching through them can really overwhelm the reader, and they may never find the answer to their question. One of the things that I come across with our editors very often is this concept about how many clicks it takes for users to get to a specific page or piece of content. The idea that people need to be able to reach certain information in 3 clicks or less, right? That while there are lots of different perspectives on the number of clicks that's being appropriate, there has been this 3-click rule that's kind of this persistent, unofficial heuristic that says that no page should take more than 3 clicks, or maybe taps on a touch screen to access, or that the most important information should take no more than 3 clicks to get to. And so I did a little bit of reading, and it turns out that that there's no data to actually support that 3-click rule, right? That 3-click rule assumes users are going to get frustrated and give up on tasks if it requires more than 3 total clicks to be completed. And so there's no published study to date that actually supports that particular rule. In fact, there was a recent study that showed that user drop-off did not increase when the task involved more than 3 clicks, and nor did satisfaction decrease. So click counting by itself is not a meaningful metric for a couple of reasons. One, the number of clicks needed to complete the task is going to depend not only on the design, but also on the task complexity. So an absolute number that's applicable to all tasks is just not possible. Not all clicks are created equal either. Some can result in a longer wait time, for example, if a new page is loaded, and others are instantaneous for perhaps like clicking on a jump link. The number of clicks rarely tells the whole story. There are many aspects of design that contribute to usability, and so whether a task flow involves 2 clicks or 10. In the real world, users make mistakes, they misunderstand things, and they get confused along the way. So simply counting the number of steps in a process misses out on what users actually do, and as well as the opportunities to provide them with a less frustrating experience. Oops. So while limiting the amount of effort that's required to access key information or to accomplish a task is indeed important, that 3-click rule is arbitrary. There's nothing inherent about 3 clicks as some sort of magical threshold before users get frustrated. More important than focusing on the raw number of clicks is to make sure that your navigation is well organized with clear pathways so that your content gets progressively more specific the deeper into the site structure your users advance. And as well as that your site visitors always know where they currently are and how to get to their destination. So while writing plain, clear, scannable content is important, it's also important that not only that our content is well written and well structured, but that it's accessible to everyone. And most recently, in Gartner's top strategic predictions for 2020 and beyond, they wrote that by 2023, the number of people with disabilities employed will triple due to artificial intelligence and emerging technologies reducing barriers to access. So it's more important than ever that we provide accessible content to all of our users, not only to the American public and international audience, but also those that we serve internally as well. So I'm going to be covering what I consider 11 key accessibility factors. These were actually produced by Princeton University, and they don't cover everything. And being able to sort of check these 11 boxes does not mean that all of a sudden you are now fully, accessible and compliant. But these factors, if you try to really make sure that you're following all 11 of them, the likelihood of you having accessible content is significantly high. So accessibility factor number 1, alternative text. It's probably the one most of us are the most familiar with, but alternative text describes each image's meaning in context. So there are still some restrictions on alt text, right? I think you don't want alt text to be more than around 160 characters. There used to be a time where assistive technology could only read a number of characters in alternative text. I don't know that that is still the case, but again, you're supposed to provide enough text information to describe that particular image's use in context. And if you have the ability to programmatically mark an image as decorative so that screen readers skip it entirely, then that's also recommended if the only purpose of the image is decorative. 2, headings need to be formatted as heading elements. So H1, H2, H3, etc., not just big, bold text. Assistive technologies have ways of generating outlines or allowing users to skip to various sections of your site. And if your headings are simply big, bold text and not structurally as headers, then your site outline or your page does not have that structure that maybe a visual user would be able to interpret. 3, make sure your lists are formatted as true lists and not just symbols and numbers. I see this a lot when we use Drupal as our content management system. When people copy from, for example, Word into a rich text field in Drupal, many times Drupal is smart enough to catch that and will convert those items into true list items, but that's not always the case. So especially if you're copying and pasting from other sources, you want to make sure that the list items, when they are pasted into the final product, are indeed list items and not just symbols and numbers that have been typed in. 4, tables. Tables are notoriously difficult to make accessible, but for simple data tables, it's important that your tables have real header cells. So not just bold text or background colors, but that they're structurally identified as the header. Without that, assistive technology is not able to identify the header for the data that is in the cells below or across from it. 5, it's important that color contrast be strong enough for users with low vision or color blindness. There are a host of products on the web that you can type in, foreground and background colors, hex values, RGB values, whatever you might have, and it will give you whether or not that color contrast ratio is sufficient. And I do encourage you as much as possible to try to check those color contrast ratios, because for those of us who have standard vision, I've been surprised by things that I would have thought met the color contrast ratio requirements that did not. So it's always a good idea to double check and validate whenever you're using different colors other than black on white or white on black, that you do your best to try to run those through some type of color contrast checker to validate that your colors meet those ratio requirements. 6, meaningful links. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about this one in a minute, but your links need to be self-explanatory, even out of context. So links that are poor examples of this would be click here, learn more. In and of themselves, they don't really tell you anything. But we'll come back to meaningful links in more detail in a moment. 7, identify languages. So if you have websites that have content in different languages, it's important that they're tagged as that language. So as an example, Espanol without a language tag would be read as a spaniel. 8, avoid using images of text. Now, aside from the accessibility issues that are introduced when you have text in an image, there are often bigger issues related to responsiveness, right? Many of us are working remotely or, accessing content on our mobile devices. So whether you're in an office with a large monitor, on a tiny laptop, or a mobile device, your screen resolution is going to be different. And the majority of modern websites now have set their sites so that images are responsive, meaning that they adjust and resize based off of the screen resolution of the person that the person is viewing the image on. And so the likelihood of your text being legible on all of those different screen resolutions is highly unlikely. So the recommendation is to simply avoid using using any images that have text built into them. Find a way to place an image and then have the text be separate and placed as actual text on the page. 9, avoid using layout tables. For those of us that were building websites in the mid-90s, tables were the way that we made all kinds of cool layouts and designs. That's not really necessary anymore. And certainly for those of us that use Drupal, the layout builder, which is part of core, now provides some really great out-of-the-box functionality for being able to create multi-grid layouts. So again, do not use tables to control layout, but look at ways that you can introduce the use of a grid system in your content management system or whatever other product you might be using to allow your content owners to create columns using a grid system as opposed to tables. 10, avoid using sensory characteristics that will disappear with layer or a color perception change. For example, the red items in the right-hand column. If I have any type of color blindness or color impairment, I may not be able to determine which items are red. And if I'm reading this content on my mobile device, there may not be a right-hand column. That column may have flowed below the main content. So avoid trying to use a sensory characteristics. 11, avoid using color alone to provide meaning. Now, for those of us that work inside content management systems, in most cases, our site administrators are able to produce some gates that help prevent us from presenting information in color alone. But certainly, if you have the ability to change some text color, and the only way that meaning is presented is through that use of the color, then that information is not being conveyed to people who have sight impairment or potential color blindness. So this also goes for things like charts and graphs, is that we have scenarios where people will create graphs or charts of information, and they do a really good job of, providing the data in different ways, but the color alone is not a sufficient way to differentiate between items in the chart. So something as simple as adding a pattern to your colors instead of just color can be a quick way to then make that content more accessible. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about links and meaningful links. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on writing better links, because I do think that this is one of the biggest ways that we can make the greatest impact in some of our content. When you're writing labels for links, and labels is the terminology that's used to describe the actual words that are the link text, right? The letters, the words that users click on to get somewhere. But there are what we call the 4 S's to improving findability, improvability, and accessibility. The first is to be specific. The primary purpose of that link label should communicate to a user what they're going to find on the other end of a click or a tap. Vague or repetitive information will fail that purpose. Learn more is very popular, but it fails this task. The text has a poor information scent and is bad for accessibility. With a little effort, you can transform that filler copy into a descriptive label that helps users confidently predict what the next page will be. Even a little more information can be useful. Learn about our services, for example. Sincere. A link is a promise. You should set up accurate expectations and then fulfill them. As an example, a user was once on a travel website looking for a tour she wanted to book. She was on the page of the tour she wanted to book and saw a link, more info, and book. So she clicked it. But then she was annoyed because she was taken to a pop-up with a contact form, which was not what she was expecting. That label could have been improved by being just a little more transparent about the next step in the process. Contact us to book. Substantial. So eye tracking research shows that people pay attention to salient items of a user interface. So what that means is that links that are styled differently from static text, they stand out and they draw our eyes. So as a consequence, links need to be able to stand on their own. They have to make sense without any other context, things like taglines or descriptive text. Here's an example from a university homepage: restoring vision and hope. What does that mean? Hope for what, right? A vision for the future? That link actually took users to an article about a program that provided eye care to Syrian refugees. So being a little less clever, but more straightforward, such as providing eye care to Syrian refugees, would have created a more substantial and succinct and sincere and specific link label. Succinct is our fourth S, right? And this is where we get to the point as quickly as possible to increase the likelihood that someone will find and use the link as they scan the page. Now, notice this is last in the list. It's because it's important, but it needs to be balanced with other priorities. So there's no set maximum limit, and that link label can be as long as it needs to be to achieve those other priorities, but no longer than that. Each word included in your link label should support your goals. So let's transition to a moment here to talk about files. And when I files, I mean things like PDF documents, Microsoft Office files, and more. And so the Nielsen-Norman Group, which are world leaders in research-based user experience, conducted research that has spanned over 20 years. And that research has proven that PDFs really are problematic for online reading. Yet they're still prevalent, and our users continue to get lost in them. And those of us that work in government are probably some of the worst offenders in this case of just drafting and publishing tons of documents instead of web content. PDFs are unpleasant to read and navigate, and they are still considered unfit for digital content. There are several reasons for why. PDFs are usually converted from documents that were planned for print, or they were created in print-focused platforms. They look completely different from typical web pages. They take users out of a familiar context and into one that is outdated and clunky. And even if your PDF is, beautiful, has some wonderful design elements, and you think users will be able to navigate with things like keyboard shortcuts like Control or Command F to find that information, think again. Even the most polished PDFs still look out of place in a web browser, and not all users know keyboard shortcuts. The studies repeatedly observed even advanced users getting stuck in PDFs and failing to find information. PDFs are slower to load. And while the risk of crashing a user's browser or a computer by serving up a PDF is significantly lower these years now than they were in the past, they can still be significantly slower to load both on desktop and in mobile. PDFs also tend to lack real substance when you compare them to regular pages. When you're building out a web page, you can visibly see how long it's getting and how far users have to scroll to consume the content. And methods of structuring and formatting digital content, such as chunking, using bullets and headlines, anchor links, etc., those things that help users efficiently skim and scan sections to find information, those techniques aren't always used and in PDFs, because often they are generated more like a print product. So content creators tend to favor quantity of content over quality and formatting when they're building their PDFs. And so what you end up with is ultimately significantly longer PDF documents than you would have if that content was simply presented on a web page. And because PDFs aren't web pages, they don't include a standard navigation like your website would. And users can struggle to stay oriented with where they are and how to get back to where they were, especially when PDFs open in a new browser tab or window and a user doesn't notice. They'll wonder why the browser's back button doesn't work and how they can get back to where they were before. And most PDFs don't have an internal navigation. That little mini information architecture that might be through pages or the bookmarks, it's completely hidden. And not everyone even knows that it's there. So people don't have a quick way of understanding the type of content that's available to them in the PDF. And getting to the interesting bits without scrolling through everything is nearly impossible. And finally, PDFs are sized for paper, not for screens. And the PDF layouts are often optimized for a printed sheet of paper, and that never aligns with the size and scale of a user's browser window. So if you've ever had to open a PDF in a mobile device, you know what I'm talking about. The pinching and the zooming in and the sliding here, left and right, simply to read the most basic information is significantly more frustrating than simply having that text being on a responsive page that you can view in your mobile device. So no matter how tempting it is, you should never use a PDF to display content that users need to read online. Obviously, we are not all resourced to convert all of our PDF content all of the time, but we do highly recommend that if you don't have to generate a PDF or a file, and you are able to generate that as web content, that you should. But if you must, and there are many cases certainly where there are 40, 50-page print reports, and they need to stay as a print product, but we want to make them available to our users online, and or not resourced to be able to generate a digital version of the report and the print version. And so, we do the best we can with the resources that we have. We do say that if you must post files, try to always use a PDF versus, say a Word or a PowerPoint, unless the source document is a template for something. Most users have their browsers set up to allow PDFs to open up in the browser window, whereas most Office files or other file types require the user to download the file to their computer before they can then open up and read it. And most users, many users, I know I do specifically, if I click on a link and it tries to get me to download something, I usually just cancel it and move on. It's a reminder that 508 compliance is not optional, right? 508 compliance applies both to files as well as web content. It applies to all, IT communications content. We also say at the EPA, we have standards that say metadata for files is not optional. It makes a big difference in the findability of your files, as well as how those files might show up in search results. So take advantage of those document properties that are available in all of the different file types to provide a human readable title, and maybe standardize how you might display your author. By default, most of the time our Office products will just throw in the username of the person that created the file. Whereas, especially if you're posting it on the public web, that you might need a standardized agency identifier for author. And again, just remember, files are not web content, and so it's difficult to apply a lot of those digital chunking and layout features that we talked about for creating good web content. So finally, I'd say, well, there's a lot of things. Please tell me that there's some things out there that can help me accomplish some of these things. So while I do not have certainly an exhaustive list, there are some of my favorites that I like to use and that I try to tell users about. One is called the Hemingway Editor, and it is available both for the web, meaning it runs in the browser and it's completely free, no login or sign up required. And there is a desktop application as well. I can't personally speak to the desktop application. I've never tried it, but I do regularly use the browser-based tool. But the Hemingway Editor, it runs like a spell checker, but it's for style. So what the Hemingway Editor will do is will highlight when your writing is too dense, to help identify when you might want to remove some needless words or help to split a sentence in two. It identifies adverbs, right? So instead of adverbs, you can use a more powerful verb. For instance, instead of saying that someone is walking slowly, you could say they tiptoed or they crept. And that way your writing is more vivid. It also helps to identify words that can be simpler. So eliminating helping you to identify words that maybe are a little too complicated. And so instead of utilizing a big word, you could use a more common synonym if they exist. It also helps to identify passive voice. So for instance, John threw a ball is better than the ball was thrown by John. So there's a lot of style things that the Hemingway Editor can help you identify. And it's a wonderful product that you can just sort of copy and paste or you can write directly in the browser based tool as well. In addition to using it for the web, I often use it sometimes when I'm just writing an email. And if I have to write an email that I know is going to be a little bit longer than maybe I would prefer, I might throw it into the Hemingway Editor just to see if there's ways that I can trim it down. For those of us that run Drupal sites, there is a fantastic contrib module called Editorally. And, I liken it to like the modern spell check, right? It works as well as it does because it's always running. When you put spell check behind a button, few people will remember to run it. Editorally, like a modern day spell checker, it runs automatically and it runs in context. And while it does not catch everything, it does focus on some of the straightforward issues that a content author could easily understand and, more importantly, easily fix, right? So yes, it won't catch everything. So it's meant to supplement, not replace true 508 digital accessibility testing, but it does catch a lot of key factors such as structure, or if you've written in all caps, if you have text that's bold, it might ask you, hey, this text is bold. Should it be a header? Perhaps it should be formatted as a header. Or it will remind you that there are certain things that need manual checking. For example, when you create a link to a file, it's going to highlight that as something that requires a manual check. The tool can't check the document for compliance, but it can remind you that it needs to be compliant. And the latest version, version 2, that came out this week, actually has some really significant improvements to the product. And it also has some reporting built in, which is really nice. There are a couple of other helpful tools. Google Lighthouse is actually one that I only just learned about in the last week or so. It's an open source automated tool that's supposed to measure quality of a web page. So it does things like accessibility, search engine optimization. I haven't used it too much just yet, but I've played around with the Chrome extension and it's very promising. Many of us use Google Analytics, and oftentimes we kind of focus on page views to make sure that people are visiting our pages, but there are some other features that Google Analytics allows you to track. So things like the time spent on a page or a bounce rate, just being able to analyze and take a look at that data and see what your users are doing, where they're coming from and where they're going, to help make sure that the user journeys that you expect them to go on are indeed working. And so it gives you some just other additional helpful information. I feel like even though I've spent hours and hours in Google Analytics, there's still so much about it that I have yet to learn about ways to make to improve my sites. And I know that there are a lot of government agencies that are able to use Site Improve, which is a wonderful product that generates all kinds of great reports on accessibility, as well as broken links reporting, things of that nature. I work primarily on intranet sites, so unfortunately, we're not able to use Site Improve. Too many security issues to allow the product to kind of reach into the firewall. So we are not able to use that, but it does often have, it certainly works very well on our public website. So that is actually the end of my presentation. I've got some reference material, all of the things that I talked about today. Those are not just, Jessica's opinion. Those are all of the data that I supplied, all of the content. To be honest, it's not mine. It's all comes from the series of experts that work in this space. The Nielsen Norman Group specifically has some phenomenal articles and videos. I've listed those here in the final presentation slide that we'll make available, as well as just some links to some other references that are out there and the tools that I mentioned. Those are here as well. But at this point, I'm going to pause for questions. I see.
You have one by Diane. You see that one, Jeff?
I just pulled that up. Did you see a specific?
Yeah, it's, will you address the length of the web page? It used to be a standard practice not to go more than 1.5 pages, but I see some web pages go on forever. Personally, I lose interest and get frustrated. You especially find this for responsive design.
Yes, so absolutely. So, again, the length of a page is really subjective, right? The length of a page on a mobile device versus a laptop screen versus a large monitor is going to be different. And so this is where we kind of talk about why it's important to write in the inverted pyramid style, where you get the most important information up front, the information you need users to know, and that you get progressively more detailed with that additional information, the nice to know, the further down that you go. Because users who are interested in all of those details, if that information sent is strong and your web page is properly chunked with headings to allow users to then scan that content and understand what's going to be there, the farther down the page they move, they'll be motivated to keep going. But only if the information sent is strong and only if your content is well structured. Yes.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Does anybody else have any questions for Jess?
Okay, looks like I just did such a good job answering all the questions. Nobody has any more, right? Yes, I will make sure the slide deck is available. I'm pretty sure, Nika, do you publish the slide decks on the website?
Yeah. If you send it to me, I'll publish it on Drupal for Gov website.
Awesome. Yes, and then we can link to it from the YouTube description as well. We should be able to have that so that you have access to all of the references and things that are on here for sure.
Thank you, Jess. That's such an important topic, especially with government websites.
Absolutely. And, I do think it is one of those things, those of us that work in the web, right? It's sometimes we'll look at pages and think, oh my gosh, who thought to write it like this? And we sometimes forget, and we have to try to remember, and I'm guilty of this too, that we have now, with the advent of content management systems, we really are expecting users that have little to no experience, in writing for the web, overall usability and accessibility, to now be able to generate web pages that follow all the rules that they may not even be aware of. So the more that we can help engage in our content owners and teach them some of these best practices, the more likely we are to get better written content that we can then help them make better. I do see there's a question here on accordions. So at the EPA, we are adopters of the US Web Design System, and the US Web Design System does have accordions. I personally am not the biggest fan of them. And at the EPA, we actually have made the decision not to use them. There were several instances where content that was behind those accordions would not always show up in search results, or we had some user testing where users would perform a search, get taken to a page where the content was there, but because the content was hidden behind an accordion, the users missed it. So I think especially with mobile devices and the fact that we, just sort of use our fingers to scroll up and down, and the ability to move up and down a page, I personally am not a fan of the accordions. And if I'm ever on a website that has them, I always look for the expand all so that I can expand all the accordions and scan the content. But I think there's some subjectivity around that. Good question.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
And see everybody next month. Bye.